Thank you for joining me today for the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation Holocaust Education Center podcast series. I am joined today by Lisa Libman. She is an active Jewish community member and has lived in the Champaign-Urbana area since 1978. She is a former Sinai Temple president and the former president of the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation. Lisa has been married to true Champaign Townie Bill Libman for 46 years. She's here to tell her family's story. Thank you so much for joining me today, Lisa.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Let's talk about your family history, and I'd like to start with your father. Your father came over in 1935 when he was 20. He was affected by the Nuremberg laws, and among other things, he was not allowed to attend university. His father was a manufacturer of men's clothing. He was reluctant to leave his business. His sister, her family, his parents, they all came over just after Kristallnacht on one of the last ships allowed into the U.S. You personally have described their departure as harrowing. Can you describe what made their departure so difficult?
Well, of course, the laws had gotten worse and worse and worse over the years, so that it became clear that things were not going to be getting better, even for the wealthier Jews. My aunt really was the one who understood that if she didn't take action to help to get her parents and her own family over, including her two young children at the time, she just could see and understood that it would be dire consequences for not leaving. So many people thought it couldn't happen to them, and they couldn't picture leaving because it's so hard to pick up and leave. In order to get the visas at that time, it was nearly impossible. The United States were not accepting very many people into the United States, and it was hard to get a visa out of Germany. So both ends were extremely limited. We had the good fortune to have family members. Lester Aaron was the patriarch of this particular family, who were first cousins of the family in Germany, and they owned a huge pottery company. The biggest brand that you would recognize would be the Fiesta ware. They helped my father come over. He left in 34 and arrived right in 35. Also helped to get visas for the rest of the family to come over. So I think without that contact, it would be very unlikely that my family would have been able to get the American visa to come. In order to even get anything, any of the German visas, my aunt had to bribe herself through every step along the way, from using food, which was very scarce, or maybe a beautiful alligator purse or a scarf or whatever it took to move herself through the lines. My aunt had a lot of chutzpah, and she used it to get this kind of movement through the process. And thankfully, when they were able to get all the paperwork together, then they had to leave Germany. And she had two young children, and they took a train and they split up and they went in different groups, so that her husband went a different route than she, in part to try to make sure everyone would be safe and have better odds of arriving. I'm actually not positive if my grandparents came with her at that time. I think they might have. One of the stories is that she had been told by a woman on the train when they just got there that they were going to have a check for the children and ask the children to come so they could get special food and treats. And this woman said, "Don't let yourself be separated from your children. It's the worst thing you can do." And it proved to be a godsend, because she later found out that the children who had been separated never returned to their parents. She was able to get her family out and went from one place to the next and finally arrived. So harrowing in that it was difficult to achieve, but they did manage to do it. And of course, leaving Germany at that time meant leaving almost everything. My father and my aunt did come from a successful manufacturing family. They had a lot of help in their home. And one of the women who worked for them for a lifetime, essentially, took their valuables, so goblets and whatever they had, which turned out to be a pretty significant amount, and took it to her family's farm and buried it. And the story is that after the war ended, about in the early 50s, after our family was well established and contact was made, she dug it up and returned it. And in that period of time, Germany had a terrible food shortage. And Germans, even on a farm, were starving because of the war. It was an incredible tribute to this woman's devotion to our family that she would go and actually return these items. Years later, we met with her when we went back to Germany, and it was really an honor. And I couldn't hear her story because she would be speaking in German, and I never learned to speak German. But it was an interesting side story to the whole problem of leaving almost nothing.
You have such detailed accounts of what your family went through and what led up to their departure. Was it from written journals? Was it your family telling you oral history? Or how did you obtain such detailed knowledge about this?
Well, a little bit of both. My Aunt Anne, as I always called her, wrote a journal when she was in her 80s about her growing up. It's on Amazon. One of my cousins put it on Amazon because I don't have the hard copy here. And I was just going through it again this morning, try to refresh my memory. Didn't get very far today, but it was interesting the details she gave of growing up when she was a child in World War I, when again there were terrible food shortages, and how many family members passed away during the war, were killed in the war, how the families managed. Her father had to leave for the war, and she did recount going to this celebration where the men marched off to war. And as a young child, it seemed very exciting, and she didn't understand why her mother was crying. Very detailed. And it's interesting, whenever somebody tells a story, they tell it through their own lenses. Whether the story is 100% accurate, I will never know for sure. The family lore, there's a lot of family lore, and it's partly through her journals, it's partly through shared stories when we would get together and talk about these kinds of things at family holidays that we shared.
Your own father joined the military. He ended up joining the Army Air Corps as a flight officer. He flew the Hump, the supply lines over the Himalayan mountains, to bring supplies from India to China. How did your father describe his time while in the Army Air Corps?
I have to give you a little bit of a backstory here. My father spoke 6 or 7 languages fluently. And when he came to America, he started working over at the company that made the Fiesta wear and found that he didn't like that. He wanted to be back into men's clothing manufacturing. So he got a job at a place in Columbus, Georgia, at Cohen's Haberdashery. And when he was there, he realized that he wanted to learn to fly. Now, I never found out if he wanted to learn because he was just fascinated with learning to fly, or if he thought maybe it would help him in case there was a war. Because, of course, the war was brewing. And, he left Germany because of that. So if it was any combination of reasons, he took lessons and he became eventually, when he joined the Army Air Force, a flight officer. It was about the time that he joined, there's a little story I'd like to add, that my father's name, his birth name was Ernst Libman. And of course, I married a man whose name is Libman. And had my father not changed his name to Lane, and I'll tell you why we think that happened, I would be Lisa Libman, which would be a real tongue twister. My father changed his name, we thought, because he thought he would be sent to Europe to be acting as a translator of some sort during the war because of his skills. But because he was a pilot, during this time, this whole theater of war in the India, China, or theater of which they called the Hump for the Himalayas, was really revving up. And I think he was serving there for 2 years, and it was a tremendously dangerous place to work. They think that more people were killed flying the Hump than had been bombed down in the European theater. It was so dangerous because they would leave Assam in India, which was at almost sea level, I think, that place where he would leave, and have to go way up high really, really fast in order to achieve the altitude they needed to get over the Himalayas. And flying over the Himalayas itself was incredibly dangerous because there were huge updrafts of over 100 miles an hour, which could send any kind of a plane and an inexperienced pilot into disaster. And of course, flying over these mountains would create all kinds of icy conditions. So the planes would have ice on their wings and have to try to de-ice, which added a lot of weight. So it was a very treacherous flying experience. And more than 1,300 soldiers died crashing into the mountains. And if they survived or crashed into the jungles below, they would be lucky if they survived that or might have been picked up by local tribe that was helpful to the Allied group. So it was a treacherous time. Now, what did my father tell me about that? The real thing that my father told me was that I couldn't make any noise in the kitchen while he was on the phone because all noise, like running the water, made it so he couldn't hear what he was trying to hear. Flight, I learned that the loud sound of the motors really had an effect on his hearing. And by the way, most of the planes were two-engine planes, and if one of the engines went out, it was often a disastrous if they weren't able to save the other. So I just wanted to share that because that route was a treacherous, treacherous route.
That I'm still focused on the fact that you said he spoke 7 languages. Was that something he learned through grade school? He self-taught?
My father, his sister were very well educated. They were able to have so many teachers as they were growing up, even in the home, tutors, and they were well traveled. He was fluent in all these different languages. You know, he was unable to attend university because of the Nuremberg laws. So after a few years of living at home, and after having read Mein Kampf, may I add, he said he read the writing on the wall and he felt he didn't have a future. And it was hard for him because he always wanted to go into the men's clothing manufacturing business, but that wasn't meant to be.
You've mentioned his sister a couple times. After the war, your father received a letter from his sister. She encouraged him to go to Shanghai. She said that she had a dream of people they knew, a vision of a chalkboard, and then he went and he was able to find German refugees from his hometown. Can you describe exactly what he found? You describe him as a liberator to this group. What exactly happened there, and what did your father do to help them?
Let me explain that my aunt had at an early age other clairvoyant premonitions. At one point in time, she was a few years older than my father. She had a premonition that he might drown and had even a date for when this could happen. It came in dreams to her. It turned out that at one point in time, he had to have been saved. He fell into a river and he was saved, thank God, because she had had this premonition and was so on edge that day. So when she had this dream of a chalkboard and some people she knew from her hometown sitting under a chalkboard, it was all that she knew. That was it. And so she asked my father, after the war, he was able to go to Shanghai. So when he went there, I remember from him, he said he got a shave and a haircut at a German barber that was there. There, a lot of Germans had gone to Shanghai to try to get through the war and a lot of Russians. But the Russians would be more or less together in one area, one schoolhouse, and the Germans in another. Apparently, it was the German barber who said, I know that there are some Germans and they're in a schoolhouse, and he gave them directions. And my father got on a rickshaw and went over to this schoolhouse and was just aghast at what he found. They were all starving. A 300-pound man who had been his former barber was now like a skeleton, if you can imagine. They were starved, they were malnourished, cold. They didn't have anything, and they had no idea that the war had ended. So it was my father who said, the war has ended, you're free to go, but let me get you some things to help you. And he went back into the city, got blankets and food and whatever supplies it was that he thought could help them, brought it back to them so that they could begin their journey back to wherever they needed to go after the war.
One of the people he liberated was Werner Michael Blumenthal, who was the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury under President Jimmy Carter. Did your father remain political?
No. In our household, my parents would always laugh that they would each vote against each other and cancel each other's votes. My mother actually became a lot more political when she was in her 60s and 70s, but not my father.
I want to focus on you a little bit. On your father's side, you were a first generation American. Your mother's family had emigrated from Belarus in the 1870s. On her side, you are a fourth generation American. Growing up, your father's German family and their stories of rags to riches had a profound influence on you. What is one of your earliest memories of realizing your father's side wasn't born in America?
Well, actually, it was almost more riches to rags in my father's place because they had come from a very successful company and way of life, and then came to America with basically nothing. It was very obvious from the get-go. My father, even though he spoke so many languages, still had a strong German accent, as did my aunt. So I always knew he was a little different. He was older than my mother by about 10 years. He was like a reticent father, but we had stories of the war that I think really came to fore in the early 60s when the films of the Holocaust became more prevalently shown. And they were horrifying to all of us. And I saw that in the very early 60s when I was in my first 10 to 12 years old, I'd say. So there was very impressionable. And yet, my father really didn't speak much about that. We did lose some distant family members there. And certainly on my mother's side, they lost family members there. I remember coming across a pack of letters that my aunt had written to family, must have been to Belarus. And I saw that the packages stopped coming back around 1944. So it was clear that they had perished.
Since your family was forced to flee, have you or any of your extended family ever returned to Germany?
One of the things that happened was that in 1982, my father took our whole family back to Germany, to Aschaffenburg, which is where he grew up. So Germany sponsored many of what I call their guilt trip reunions to have people come from the towns to talk about their experience and what they were doing now and how they felt about leaving. And I remember sitting at a table of my aunt's friends, and they 201 said they were Germans first. They didn't understand how this could have happened. They were shocked that this could have happened to them. At this time, so many years later, they were still talking about the unbelievable aspect of how it could have happened. I found that fascinating.
On this trip, did most people come from America? Were they from Israel? Were they from other parts of Europe?
And they went to all corners of the world. It was so nice that they had the ability to come back together again here. And then we went to a museum here at Aschaffenburg, had talked about, traced the lineage of the families, and our family was traced really far back into about the 1600s, probably came from Spain, part of the diaspora movement. How my grandfather had sold his business to his foreman, who bought it at a pittance of the value, but nonetheless was able to keep it going. Talked about his heritage, that back, maybe 300 or 500 years prior, there had been a Jewish blood in that family, but it was too far back to be have counted being Jewish. It was very interesting to go back to that town and see it and feel it from their eyes.
Did your father talk in detail about daily life anxiety, or did you pick up anything in his personality that everyone from that era inhabited in some way or another?
My father was interviewed through probably the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, which is where the family settled. There was a large German population and a large German Jewish population in Milwaukee. I know that he participated in these interviews at the time. The 50s was a time of growth and trying to put it aside and put it behind them. And so he really didn't talk much about it growing up. And I regret not hearing the stories from him specifically, as it would be nice having that. But it wasn't something he wanted. He had married an American woman and he was bringing up American children, and he had some habits and some traditions at the dinner table. We always had Shabbos dinner every Friday night, and we would say the prayers for the bread and the wine. My father, I just love this, would always give us a little thimbleful of wine or beer, as the case may be, because my father was German and drank beer. So growing up, I would have that for Shabbat. And it was interesting because I never felt a need to go out drinking with the kids. You know, everybody would go out drinking in high school. But not that I was imbibing a lot of alcohol at home, but I just didn't feel the need to. But part of it was because that was the tradition. Every child would have that little bit of wine for Shabbat. And that was from him. I liked that.
Did you grow up with a relationship with your aunt? Did you also hear first person accounts from her as well?
We would get together for all the holidays. We would divide which holidays. Passover would be at her house, and the high holidays would be at our house, or however it worked out. And there were stories and families that we get together. And they were, again, probably trying to move forward during those times. As she became older and she wrote this story, it was a chance to talk about some of that together. It wasn't like we were told this is exactly what happened. Just, I don't know how it infiltrated our way of life. You know, my dad was German, he escaped Nazi Germany, and this was an aspect of who we were. And my mother had this big family that had been here for so long, and that was another aspect of who we were.
Such a big aspect of who you are is your Jewish identity in Champaign-Urbana. Why were your Jewish roots in this community from 1978 on so meaningful to you?
My mother was very active in the Milwaukee Jewish community, both in the synagogue and in Federation. So I obviously learned from an example there. The whole concept of a tikkun olam was part of how we understood our Judaism. We grew up in a very Germanic Reform synagogue, Temple B'nai Jeshurun, Emmanuel. So my Judaism was more experienced through doing that kind of work. We no longer have in Champaign-Urbana the sisterhood or even Hadassah, and I was involved in both of those. It was a way to establish relationships, made wonderful friendships through that. I think it's a big loss to our community that we don't have those organizations now, because women would get together and plan big events for the whole community. It was really a defining part of growing up as a young wife, I guess I'd say, and having our family. That was an important aspect of how I experienced my Judaism at that time.
Out of curiosity, since you have traveled the world and you live part of the year outside of the Champaign-Urbana community, what do you think is such a great cohesive element of the Jewish community in this college town?
Well, for me, not to be redundant, having those friendships were really important and cohesive for me. Doing the work I did helped me to get to know a wider range of people. I'd have to say now, I actually have become a little bit more involved in two committees from the Federation on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust committees, because I think they're so potently important right now. So I'm just starting to get a little bit involved in doing it there, and actually doing it in Sarasota, the same kind of work. It's very different. The towns I have different gestalts, if you will. There's something so delicious about a small town environment that helps to form friendships that I have found essential. Another important part is that I've been in a book club, and now two book clubs in Champaign for 45 years, one of them. So those friendships have been important.
Before I let you go, one more question. We are hours from 3 hostages being released in Israel, and at the time of this podcast, when it's posted, hopefully all of them will be home. That's your and my hope, if I can speak for you. What do you think is the number one thing that you want the world to know about Jews and about why we're scared, why we haven't forgotten anything that's happened in the Holocaust, why we are so close knit, and why we are always sort of on edge? What do you want the world to know about that?
Well, this is not news. It's happened since the beginning of time, the beginning of time regarding the Jewish world. I always thought it was because we were, quote, chosen, and that there was jealousy there. But really, being chosen meant we're supposed to follow the laws of Judaism. Not so easy right there. But just following the laws of Judaism has kept us separate. And that separateness, which we don't have so much now, obviously, there's less of that, less people following the laws, the traditional laws. That has been a part of it, I think. People haven't understood why we would be separate. And now I think we have so integrated into the communities, we've lost a lot of our Judaism, as people have lost their religions, not just Jews, but so many people are finding that religion is not a part of what brings them wholeness. So Judaism for me is like the center of life. It is what my world revolves around. But this anti-Semitism that has been rampant has reemerged, unfortunately, for a lot of reasons. And I just pray that it tones down again. And when the war tones down in Israel, Gaza, and elsewhere, that might bring a sense of less anti-Semitism and more calm throughout the world. I can only pray that would be the case.
Thank you for listening to the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation Holocaust Education Series. Lisa Libman, I really appreciate you sharing your family's story today. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thank you for doing this too. It's a wonderful service to our community and to whoever is able to tune into these podcasts.